They haven't heard of the events in Point Pleasant from 1966 to 67. So what I hear from people constantly is that, they've been holding on to their sighting for years, in some cases decades, because they literally had no idea that anybody else had ever seen anything even remotely similar. At best, maybe they saw that Richard Gere movie, based on Keel's book. But I mean, even then, that's pretty rare. So, it's been a pretty fascinating journey. And recently, actually, we've got a couple of those historical reports. One of which I actually found particularly interesting. So, I was contacted by a spiritual author, and she had, this wasn't actually her account either, so she wanted to share this on behalf of her late father. And so this author, she gave me her actual name too, but she goes by a pen name, and so she wanted me to use her pen name, and so that's the name that I'm going to use. And so she goes by, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Nefer Kepri. And she has a website, and people can go check her out and see what sort of things that she writes about. I think she does some work with tarot and other things similar to that. But anyway, she, it was meaningful to her to be able to find us and report her late father's sighting. And so this happened in 1976. She said that she actually grown up in Waukegan. And so if anybody doesn't know where that is, it's basically sort of the northernmost part of Chicagoland. So like a far northern part of that larger metropolitan area. And so her dad was out one night. He worked part-time nights at Victory Memorial Hospital over there. And one night after work, he had went out to help his friend who had car trouble at the local marathon restaurant. And so this was on some train tracks, like right on Lake Michigan. Like you could see the lake. You're practically on the beach. And it was a full moon that night. And as they're in the parking lot, where her dad's given his friend's car a jump start, he suddenly just was overwhelmed by this feeling of terror, like just out of nowhere. Didn't notice anything in particular other than he was just suddenly very, very, very frightened. And so he starts looking around, and there were two really tall silos in that area, maybe 2-3 stories high. And as he's looking around, frightened, seemingly inexplicably, he sees in the moonlight this black figure crouched on top of one of these silos. And he says it had these glowing red eyes. And, he gets his friend's attention, of course, and points the thing out. So his friend sees it too. And, after the fact, he guessed that maybe it was 6 feet tall or so, but it looked big, it was pretty bulky, and he was sure it wasn't any kind of bird. And because of that, of his fear, he said he could sense that it was evil. And so, they didn't have his friend's car fixed at this point. But regardless, he just grabbed the cables. He and his friend jump into his car, and they just get out of there. They leave the friend's car. They'll come back for it later. And as they're driving away, they hear this loud swooshing sound, and then felt something hit and slide across the top of her dad's car. He kept going because at this point nothing was going to stop them from getting out of there. And the next day he goes and checks, and he finds these 3 long scratches on the roof of the car. And now, so now for, she's a relatively young kid at that point, but she remembers specifically, she went out and she saw these scratches. She said they were about 1/4 of an inch apart. There were 4 of them, and she described them as looking like the talon of a large bird that had scratched his car. And so, this is interesting for a number of reasons. And, one, obviously, it matches a lot of the other reports that we've given, that we've received, that we've been given, very, very closely. But beyond that, she was able to give me a lot of really good, really specific detail about this sighting. She told me that her dad always got off work at 10 p.m. It's maybe a 15-minute drive over to that Marathon restaurant from the hospital, 20 at the most. So he was probably there around 10:30. And she remembered specifically that school had just let out for the summer, but it was before her birthday. So that puts this sighting sometime in early June. And then, if you remember, he was very clear that it was a full moon that night. So I got on Weather Underground, which is my absolute favorite site for looking up any historical weather data, and I just started trying to verify everything, because that's the first thing. If you get a story like this and you can look at all of the geographic and weather data and everything that you can verify, and it checks out and it matches everything, then that certainly means more, obviously, than if you can't. Doesn't necessarily prove anything. If it was an elaborate story, then they put a lot of work into it. But anyway, I get on there. I'm able to verify everything. Turns out there absolutely was a full moon with basically no cloud cover, certainly no cloud cover at the time he would have seen it on Friday, June 11th. So everything checks out. Moonrise on that day was 8:01 p.m. Weather conditions were fair. That means that moon would have been in the sky and visible at 10:30 p.m. that evening. And so, being able to get that kind of detail from her, and then being able to go and independently verify it, that's as credible of a report almost as any I think we've received so far. And this took place in 1976. And so, that's only, 9 years, less than 9 years since the end of the Point Pleasant sightings. It's just mind-boggling to me that we keep getting these historical reports in.
Well, I think, too, Tobias, I think people now are not scared to talk about it. 10, 15, 20 years ago, people were scared to talk about, anything cryptic or UFOs because they were scared what other friends, coworkers would think of them. But I think all that has changed because the paranormal has kind of blossomed. And people can talk about it, and at least the majority of people, when you talk to them about it, they don't look at you as strange. And, another thing, thinking about this, when she was telling you about the moon and the weather and all that stuff, and you went back and checked it, if they were making up a BS story, let's face it, they're not going to even think about, well, what was the weather like at that time frame? When did the moon come out? And when did it go? They wouldn't even thought about that. So when it all matches, that gives it a lot more credibility.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's really something else. And you're absolutely right. Like, most of the people who come up with sort of a BS story, and there have been, some, and they're usually pretty easy to pick out. Although I'll tell you, there haven't been as many in this Lake Michigan, Mothman flap as maybe people would expect. But usually, yeah, if somebody is going to feed you a line of BS, they're going to try to leave out as many details as possible because they don't want to have to worry about covering their tracks that much. And so, yeah, I mean, like having this level of detail, to me was pretty darn impressive. And, the fact that it all checked out, of course, just made it more so. And that's one of the things that, like I said, I really appreciate about these historical sightings. We had another one that wasn't quite as interesting to me, and this one was not even from that long ago. It actually happened in 2010. So my colleague Lon Strickler he was contacted by this witness who said that he had seen some kind of strange winged creature perched on his neighbor's roof in the spring of 2010. And so, he lived in far west Joliet. So that's just another suburb of Chicago, basically. And it was about 2 a.m. And he was watching TV, and he had the window open slightly, and he said he heard this muffled cry, and he described it almost like a woman crying in the distance. And honestly, that's a pretty new detail. I don't remember ever hearing anybody describing that kind of sound, but people have described other sounds, and I can get into that in just a minute. But anyway, so he hears this sound that he described as sort of like a woman crying in the distance. And, after a little while, he decides that, he's going to go look and see what it is. Like, he's gathered his courage, and he's going to go check it out. And so he gets up, and he's looking all over his backyard. And, it's dark out. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. And so he's looking around, and he's just about to give up because he doesn't see anything, and he hears it again. And so this time, because he's closer, when he hears it, he notices that it sounds like it's coming from above him. So he looks up, and he notices something that he described as being about 4 feet tall, sitting on the peak of the house behind him. And so, he grabs his phone to take a picture, but, honestly, I think we both know how that's going to, turn out. Anybody who tries to take a picture of anything with a cell phone in the dark, especially if it's some distance away from them, good luck. But anyway, he grabs his phone, and he's about to take this picture, and it turns its head towards him. And at that point, he's just terrified by what he sees. He described it as sort of this a gargoyle. Basically, that's the best description he could come up with for what the heck this thing looked like. And so it scares the crap out of him. And he said it sort of drops right off of this roof, and just before it hits the ground, spreads its wings and swoops away, disappears basically.
Interesting.
And it didn't exactly match most of the other reports. There were a couple of idiosyncrasies, like the height that he describes is a little shorter than what we would be used to, but again, it's crouched on top of this roof. So, maybe if he had seen it, standing up completely, it would have been taller. And the other thing that struck me as interesting was the sound that he said this thing made. Like a woman crying in the distance. Like there are natural animals that can make sounds like that. So, like if anybody's ever heard a fox or a mountain lion or something, like they sound like women screaming. Like they sound like people being tortured. It's crazy. But specifically, a woman crying in the distance, like that's a new one to me. Other people have reported sounds from whatever they saw as part of their Lake Michigan Mothman